Okay, well, thank you for coming, everyone, and thank you to those of you who are online. This is the Digital History Seminar at the Institute of Historical Research. My name is Adam Krimble. I'm going to be chairing today, and you're here to hear Emma Watkins, who is going to talk about her PhD research on juvenile convicts and death. She's a third-year PhD student at the University of Liverpool, part of the Digital Panopticon project. If you are following online and you can't quite see the slides behind Emma, they are available on our website. The link to that is on IHR Digital History Seminar website. So you should be able to find them even if you can't see them. Without further ado, I will pass over to Emma, who can share her research with us.
So I'm Emma. My research has traced the lives of juvenile convicts who were convicted at the Old Bailey in the early 19th century and were transported to Van Diemen's Land, which is now known as Tasmania in Australia. And these juvenile convicts were then compared and contrasted with other convicts transported to Van Diemen's Land, free immigrants arriving in the colony and the free population back home, and then contextualized within the punishment system, economy and culture that they were thrust into by their forced movement to Australia. And this then allows an understanding of whether these juvenile convicts who were transported were able to have settled colonial lives. And a settled life cannot be measured by a tick box exercise, but certain aspects surrounding the formation of relationships, employment and criminal assistance all point to a settled life. And being settled didn't necessarily mean climbing the social and economic spectrum of society, but rather it means the formation of a stable and normal working class life free from crime. So my research has investigated how these different aspects interacted in supporting or inhibiting a settled life. And in doing so, it'll add to the wider picture of what the lasting impact of the experience of being transported to a penal colony during youth had on life outcomes. So these juvenile offenders were traced by nominally linking primarily digitized but also archival records, including criminal and civil records and newspapers, to create a collection of life archives which were then collated into a database. And while my research has traced the whole lives of juvenile convicts, the concentration today will be on their deaths. So today we look at the age at death of these juvenile convicts who were transported to Van Diemen's Land, and also explore the causes of their deaths. So were they victims of disease, accidents, or were they dying of old age, and which factors influence this? So as you can see in this graph here, the highest proportion of juvenile convicts died when they were over 61 years of age. However, an alarming number died under 40, but particularly under 20 years of age. The average age of death for male juvenile convicts given survival until 20 years of age and provided they survived until freedom, so when they received their certificate of freedom, was 59 years of age. If juvenile convicts survived until they were free, their average age of death was the same as for all convicts that were transported, but they didn't live as long as Tasmanian-born males and were only just approaching the same life expectancy as those back in England. And when including all male juvenile convicts, the average age of death is markedly lower than for all other groups at 51 years of age, so with no conditions on their age limit. Simply put, many of the juvenile convicts died very young, and consequently this brought down their average age of death. But it was expected that juvenile convicts that were sampled would overrepresent the number of young deaths for juveniles transported as convicts. And this is because inevitably the younger a juvenile convict died, the more readily their death certificate could be found, because they were more likely to be under the supervision of the colonial state. And equally, they were less likely to have changed their names or migrated, making them easier to trace for this research. So the sample is in this way biased. Consequently, in order to compare with other juveniles and to ascertain whether it was common for juvenile convicts to die at such young ages, outside of those sampled for this research, they were compared with the death rates of those held at Point Pure. And Point Pure is a juvenile-only penal settlement, which was established in Van Diemen's Land for male convicts under 20 years of age. And 2% of these juvenile convicts at Point Pure died between 1834 and 1841, whereas in the same period, 13% of the juvenile convicts in my sample died under 20 years of age. So examination of these Point Pure death rates therefore suggests that these juvenile convicts in my sample should have had a higher mortality. So by accepting this selection bias, the question still remains, why then did such a high proportion of these juvenile convicts die so young in the sample, meaning what was different about this group of juvenile convicts? And the following aspects were then explored: the causes of their deaths, the offences and their punishments, and whether this impacted their mortality. So the juvenile convicts' causes of death were categorised, as you can see in this graph: execution, accident, disease, and natural causes in old age. And the percentage of those executed here is likely to be an overrepresentation. For example, tracing the life of juvenile convict James McAllister, tracing his life was enabled because of his visibility in the records, which resulted from his execution. So because of James's high-profile crime and his resulting death, the newspapers detailed his history, enabling his identification. So briefly, James McAllister, when he became free by servitude in Van Diemen's Land, he then migrated to mainland Australia. Specifically, he went to Melbourne, where he lived for a couple of years quietly, but then he shot and killed a female who he had earlier cohabited with. Because of this murder and his resulting execution, it was widely publicized in the newspapers. And it's possible that if it were not for this so-called newsworthy incident, he would not have appeared in the newspaper. And this, combined with his migration, would have made him increasingly difficult to find in the records. And importantly, it's important to note that the majority of juvenile convicts, as you can see, didn't die of execution, but instead died of old age and disease. So, in fact, 35% of deaths were attributable to disease. For example, John Burke died of disease of the heart, and Anthony Barkwith died of bronchitis. Both juvenile convicts died of disease, but they led very different lives. Anthony Barkwith didn't die while he was under sentence, and he also lived well above the average life expectancy. Nevertheless, it was 20 years of working in the mine which contributed to his ill health later in life. It is now, of course, widely acknowledged that bronchitis is correlated with mining. And as the case of Anthony Barkwith demonstrates, not all juvenile convicts led tragic and short lives and died due to accidents or executions, though of course it's easy to become caught up in these shocking cases. It's easy to dwell on case studies of juvenile convicts who died so young before they even reached freedom, because of course they are poignant. For example, 2 of the male juvenile convicts died on transport before they even reached Van Diemen's Land, and a further 3 died before their 16th birthdays. However, many of the juvenile convicts went on to live long lives and died of old age or natural causes. For example, James Hudson lived until he was 91 years of age, leaving behind his wife. Having been married for 64 years, he also left behind 5 living sons, 1 daughter, 40 grandchildren, and 18 great-grandchildren. So he lived a long and successful life away from crime, showing that many of them lived long lives. But while many juveniles, including that of James Hudson, didn't die of external causes, more than expected did. Male juvenile convicts' deaths due to external causes, both under and after sentence, was 20%. However, for those who survived until freedom, this dramatically decreased to 12%. Yet this is still higher than for the whole general convict population, according to Kippen and Macallan's 2015 study on Vandemonian convict mortality. Male mortality under sentence from external causes was 4.8 annual deaths per 1,000 of the population, they found. And external mortality for the total Tasmanian population was significantly lower again at 1.8 annual deaths per 1,000 of the population. For the juvenile convicts in my sample, 56% died while under sentence of external causes, compared with the 12% who survived until freedom. And external causes includes deaths attributable to an accident, suicide, assault, and execution. But for the juvenile convicts in my sample, the only relevant categories were execution and accident, so none of them died of suicide or assault. What this high proportion of external causes of death suggests is the dangerous nature of the work carried out both under and to a lesser extent after sentence. And since there's an increased rate of external mortality under sentence, the death under sentence obviously needs further investigation. 15% of the male juvenile convicts died while they were under sentence, and they were aged between 13 and 26 years of age. And evidently, all those who were executed died directly due to their offences. They were executed because of a particular offence. And convicts who died as a result of accidents and when they were working under sentence died because of the dangerous work they were forced to carry out. But the majority of convicts whose death causes are known, who died under sentence, died as a result of disease, and this may or may not be associated with accumulated insults. It's been argued by Kippen and Macallan that the prudent convict who kept out of trouble and was compliant was rewarded with increasing freedoms, while the angry and recalcitrant convict would be sucked into a, quote, vortex of savage cruelty. Therefore, the punishments received and its effects on mortality need to be explored. So was it the punishments that these juvenile convicts endured which contributed to their shorter lifespan? The punishments broadly include confinement, flogging, and hard labour. There was no immediate pattern between the punishments juvenile convicts endured and the length of their lifespan. However, for those who died under sentence, a pattern does emerge whereby those with a greater number of offences on average per year died sooner. So it's therefore not the total number of offences or particular punishments, but the number of offences in quick succession while under sentence. As in the case of the juvenile convicts in my sample, Kippen and Macallan found that the number of lashes were not significantly associated with mortality, but they did find that solitary confinement was positively correlated with mortality under sentence. But the same cannot be said of the juvenile convicts. And a reason for this may be that juvenile convicts who spent time in, for example, Point Pure and were sentenced to solitary confinement were not kept completely solitary. Benjamin Horne, who was a contemporary British prison reformer, reported at the time, quote, "I can only say that two boys are sometimes found in one of the separate cells in the morning, and that I have heard the boys in the solitary cells keep up a conversation at the full pitches of their voices during the middle of the day." So these particular juvenile convicts were therefore not undergoing true solitary confinement. Not only were they conversing with each other, but they were also somehow ending up in each other's cells. And this highlights the difficulties of finding the effects of punishment, such as solitary confinement, when its practices vary so much between establishments. But while there is no evidence that juvenile convicts' mortality was directly affected by punishment, that is, of course, not to say that there was no effect, only that the experience of punishment was so varied per juvenile convict that it would need a far larger sample to uncover it. But what is clear is that this sample of juvenile convicts did receive a great deal more punishment than their adult counterparts. While the effects of different punishments remain unclear, though, the large number of offences within a short space of time did lead to juvenile convicts being differently placed within the penal system. For example, it was because of the number of offences carried out by Charles Henson that he was put to labour in the quarry, and it was being placed in the quarry which caused his death. So the work juvenile convicts were moved down to due to their offences could sometimes lead to their deaths. But while not all of the more dangerous employments may have led directly to death, like in the case of Charles, who was killed by a runaway cart after being sent to the coal mine, it does not mean that such work didn't contribute to it through added insults to the body resulting in disease, as in the case of Anthony Barkwith, who died of bronchitis after working in the coal mines. So male juvenile convicts then overrepresent young deaths. And the answer to this lies, and the answer to why this is, lies in the causes of their deaths. Juvenile convicts were more likely to die of external causes, and this includes executions, but is mainly due to accidents or misadventure. Death is attributable to external causes is higher for juvenile convicts than for the convicts generally. Still, the most common cause of death is disease. And it would seem then that juvenile convicts were less able to cope with the work and conditions, for example, the voyage over, than their adult counterparts. Those who offended were placed in conditions or work which increased their chances of injury, death, and disease. And the juvenile convicts in the sample are representative of this. Kippen and McCallan's study also found that those who died under sentence were more likely to be older on arrival or born in industrial districts or London. And just as employers would have seen older convicts with less useful skills as being unable to adjust their skill base, juvenile convicts with a similar lack of useful skills, having not yet acquired the skills, would have been viewed in the same light, in turn leading them to be placed in risky employment. Therefore, it's the interrelationship between their offences and lacking useful skills which led these juvenile convicts to be placed in risky employment, leading to a greater chance of accidents. This placement, combined with their youth and inexperience, led these juvenile convicts to disproportionately die under 20 years of age. Certainly, if deaths from external causes are removed, the life expectancy of male juvenile convicts is increased to 62 years of age, which would bring them in line with Tasmanian-born males. So it's therefore the dangerousness of their work which affected their mortality, and they were more likely to be removed to more dangerous work if they had a greater number of offences in quick succession. With the female juvenile convicts, we're unfortunately dealing with a far smaller numbers. And so this, of course, must be borne in mind. While all the females fitting the criteria were traced, there were only 18. So they were sampled initially in the same way as the male juvenile convicts. All of the female juvenile convicts who were convicted at the Old Bailey when they were under 14 years of age between 1816 and 1850 and were sentenced to transportation to Van Diemen's Land and were actually transported were included, but there were only 18 of them. The average age of death for these female juvenile convicts was 53 years of age. Given survival until 20 years of age and freedom, the average age is increased slightly to 60 years of age, so they live longer than their male counterparts. And you can see here the age of death range in the graph, but again, we're dealing with small numbers, so of course case studies need to be turned to. And one of these female juvenile convicts was Eliza White, and she died when she was just 15 years of age. While Eliza White was under 20 years of age when she died, the rest of the female convicts, the female juvenile convicts, lived until they were at least 43 years of age. Also, Eliza was the only female to die while still under sentence. But what Eliza died of is unfortunately unknown, but she did die of disease directly after the voyage over. Eliza White was born in 1832 and she was convicted of simple larceny in 1845. She stole 2 dustpans worth 2 shillings from a dwelling house, and despite being recorded recommended to the penitentiary in the Old Bailey, she was transported for 7 years. In a previous trial, Eliza had been convicted of theft and had been given 14 days confinement. So this wasn't her first conviction. As with most of the juvenile convicts, she had a previous conviction. A petition was made by her parents, Mary and James White, to ask for mitigation on the grounds of youth. And they also, of course, promised that she wouldn't offend again. But they were unsuccessful, and she was transported to Van Diemen's Land in 1846 on board the female convict ship, the Sea Queen. The surgeon superintendent described her as, quote, bad, idle, and dirty, and sent to the hospital. So on the voyage over, she was put in the prison hospital on the transport ship. And unfortunately, as you can see in the slide, most of the records are left blank because she was ill on the transport. It was a relatively short journey, but Eliza was sick throughout. And Eliza died in 1847 and was buried at the prisoners' burial ground at Trinity Cemetery. And the records state that she was 15 when she died, but if the Old Bailey record are to be relied on, she would have been about 16 years of age by this point. And the only information on Eliza's description list, which is at the bottom of the slide, is that she was sick. For comparison then, the female juvenile convicts were compared with females transported on board the female convict ship, the Tasmania, which were researched by Cavan and Snowden. Female juvenile convicts' average age of death, given survival until freedom until they were 20 years of age, was 4.8 years longer than the female convicts who arrived on board the Tasmania. None of the females on board the Tasmania died under 20 years of age, but 7 of them did die while they were under sentence. And the average age of death for those females was 42 years of age. So when all deaths are taken into account, the female juvenile convicts on average did live longer, but only by 9 months. Of those whose causes of death, which are known, of the female juvenile convicts, none died of external causes, like 20% of the male juvenile convicts who did. Female juvenile convicts either died of disease at 60% or old age at 40%. But even those who were dying of disease lived relatively long lives. And one of these was Sarah Hodge, who was born in 1812, and Sarah died of disease after a relatively long life. She was 13 years of age when she was convicted of grand larceny. Sarah stole 3 shirts worth 30 shillings from her master and was, as a result, sent to Van Diemen's Land for 7 years. There were actually 2 indictments against Sarah in the same session, and she was transported on board the female convict ship, the Providence. The jail report describes Sarah as being of depraved habits, but the surgeon superintendent on the transport over described her as good, so they were contradictory reports. When she arrived in the colony, Sarah went on to commit 5 offences while she was under sentence. This is less than average for female juveniles. But none of these offences were serious. And while 2 of the offences were under assignment to a free settler in the colony, the last 3 offences were committed while she was assigned to her own husband. Sarah received a free certificate in 1832. As she had been a nursemaid before she was transported, but unfortunately her employment thereafter is unknown. She married twice, first to a John Wiggins, which was 12 months after arrival, so very quick after arriving in the colony, and then to a James Holman in 1847, after making her way to Victoria. In total, she had 11 children, 9 of which she had with her first husband, and the newspapers reported in 1848 that her and her second husband had purchased land in a government auction. So in the colony, she had economically bettered herself. And Sarah died of cancer in the head in 1859, aged 52. So while Eliza White then died extremely young, Sarah, on the other hand, died of cancer at a relatively old age and had many children, 2 husbands, migrated and economically bettered herself. In short, she lived a full life before she died. So while Eliza's story is poignant, it's not typical. It's difficult to make comparisons between the female juveniles and those who arrived on board the Tasmania with regards to causes of death. And this is because the causes of death for female juvenile convicts and those who arrived on board the Tasmania are only known for 39% and 25% respectively. So we're dealing with small numbers. But what does become clear is that in both groups, the most common cause of death was disease. And while no female juvenile convicts died of external causes, though 3 who arrived on board the Tasmania did. However, none of these were related to dangerous work, as in the case of the male juvenile convicts and males more generally. Those who arrived on board the Tasmania who died of external causes died during freedom, so they become free. And they specifically died to manslaughter, falling timber at the house, and accidental drowning. So while these deaths aren't due to dangerous causes, they do point to the unhappy circumstances of these females' lives. And the same, though, cannot be said of the female juvenile convicts who all died of disease. While the number of female juveniles is admittedly small, all apart from 1 died after reaching freedom. And importantly, the female juvenile convicts were not sampled, so all of those fitting the criteria were included, and all deaths under sentence would have been recorded. Therefore, 94% of the female juvenile convicts survived until freedom. And just as one of the female juvenile convicts was sick on transport, one of the female convicts who arrived on board the Tasmania convict ship died of dysentery. And this female was 20 years of age, and she also had the responsibility of feeding her baby, which would have further weakened her. So numerically, 1 in 18 female juvenile convicts died from disease on the ship, and compared with 1 in 138 of the female convicts on board the Tasmania. 7 of those who came on board the Tasmania died under sentence, but 2 of these deaths were on board the Anson hulk, and only 1 of the female juvenile convicts were found to have spent time on board this prison ship in Australia, and she was sick before she arrived on that ship. In fact, Cavan and Snowden state that these deaths under sentence were usually in one of the colonial institutions, including the Anson hulk and, of course, the female factories. Only 2 of the female juvenile convicts died in a colonial institution. The first was, of course, Eliza White, who died after the voyage over, and the second was in an invalid depot during old age, and her husband also died there, and her name was Elizabeth Jones. Elizabeth Jones was the oldest female juvenile convict when she died. She had been convicted in 1842 of stealing from her master a shawl and a bonnet worth 2 shillings and 10 pence. In her proceeding to the prosecutor, she stated, quote, "You gave me the bonnet to wear and lent me the shawl. You took me into your service at 1 shilling a week and my victuals. You never gave me a farthing of money and scarcely any victuals." But unfortunately, she was still found guilty. There was also another indictment against her in the same trial for stealing a gown and other unnamed articles to the value of 15 shillings by the same prosecutor, her master. And she was sentenced to 7 years transportation. And of course, the sentence was carried out. She was sent on board the female convict ship, the Garland Grove, in 1842. And she was originally from St. Pancras, and she was transported when she was 15 years of age. Like Elizabeth, when she was convicted and sentenced to Van Diemen's Land after arrival, when she was still under sentence, she only committed 3 offences in the colony, and they were all non-serious regulatory offences. As you can see in the top, her conduct record is relatively sparse. 4 years after becoming free, Elizabeth married Henry Rowbottom, who was a tradesman from London, and he was also an emancipist. In total, they had 4 children, but the first was born before they married. And Elizabeth died in the Invalid Depot when she was 74 years of age, and she was buried in Charles Street General Cemetery. And her husband, Charles, also later died in the same place when he was age 77. So excepting Eliza White then, none of these female juvenile convicts died while under sentence in a colonial institution, apart from in the Invalid Depot later in life. However, of the Tasmania female convicts who did, 4 were 33 years of age, but one was 46 years of age and the other was 76. So the latter at least was expected to die while under sentence. So what is clear is that these female juvenile convicts lived on average longer than the comparison group, but only marginally. And both groups mostly died of disease. In their study of female convicts transported on board the female convict ship the Tasmania in 1845, Govan and Snowdon traced the lives of 138 females. And of these convicts, deaths were found for approximately 39%, compared with 38% of the female juvenile convicts traced for this research. So the life course tracing success rate was relatively the same, or failure rate, depending on which way you look at it. The juvenile convicts were younger on arrival and therefore more likely to marry and migrate in the colony, making them increasingly difficult to find later in life. And it also has to be noted that the female juveniles were inevitably juveniles when they arrived, and the ages of those on board the Tasmania who arrived were aged between 16 and 64 years of age. 5% were over 50. However, the majority were under 29 years of age. So, of course, there are differences between these comparison groups, which need to be borne in mind. As with the male juvenile convicts, the offending of these females and their punishments were explored in order to assess the impact on their mortality. The number of offences didn't noticeably affect their mortality rate. I think for patterns to emerge, a larger sample would be needed, and the same is true of their punishments. As in the case of male punishment, female punishments and experiences would have varied according to different institutions that they were exposed to, making comparisons difficult. But what is evident is that the juvenile females, like their male counterparts, were punished more than their adult counterparts. Female juvenile convicts, excepting one, Eliza White, didn't die under sentence, and they also lived well into adulthood, and they certainly lived longer than their male juvenile counterparts. What is markedly different between the male and the female juvenile convicts are their causes of death. Unlike the male juveniles, females were less at risk of being moved down to more dangerous work due to their offences. There are no known cases of these female juvenile convicts dying of external causes. Indeed, like those who arrived on board the Tasmania ship, they were more likely to die of disease. While only 1 in 18 of these juvenile convicts died under sentence, 1 in 6.7 of the male juvenile convicts died while under sentence. Yet, it must of course be noted that these female juveniles were not didn't go through a secondary sampling process, and therefore they did not suffer from the same selection bias as the male juvenile convict sample does. Nevertheless, it highlights that these female juvenile convicts rarely died while they were under sentence. So these male juvenile convicts then died disproportionately young, and the number of deaths attributable to external causes was higher for these juvenile convicts when compared with other convicts. And the juvenile convicts had a higher rate of offending. And as a result of this offending, they were more likely to be moved to tasks or employment which exposed them to greater danger. And this, combined with their youth and inexperience, led to the increased number of young deaths, bringing down their average age of death. Whereas the female convicts lived longer than all comparison groups. And in distinction from the male juvenile convicts, the females didn't die of external causes. And this is attributable to the different work that the female convicts were employed in. So going beyond the institution and focusing directly on these female and male juvenile convicts was important in understanding the lives of this unique group. While in some ways these juveniles were treated the same and experienced the same as their adult counterparts, in many ways they were not and they did not. And this affected their life outcomes in terms of experience and mortality. And this again differed according to their sex. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Okay, so we will open up to the floor for anyone who has any questions. We've also potentially, are you doing questions online, James?
I'll monitor it from online.
James will monitor in case anybody has a question from online. If you are listening online, you're more than welcome to ask a question and James will relay it for you. Just to, I guess, start things off, I guess maybe a comment which might tie into a question, but you can't die of old age. Old age is not fatal. So just in terms of your categories, how much have the fact that you've been trying to, I guess, put this into a database and therefore you've got boxes that stuff either fits in or doesn't fit in, how much do you think this influences the way that you tell this story and whether or not what you're doing is changing the history?
Yeah, I suppose it does affect how you start looking at the convicts' lives. So they initially were all put into a database after I traced their lives, and then you go through the database looking for information, and I guess it does kind of change how you frame those lives. And yes, they can't die of old age, but those are the ones then that didn't die of execution or external causes is what I mean by that.
So what was your criteria for an old age death then?
I believe, off the top of my head, I think it was over 60, or no, over 70. So it was like a cutoff point,
so good
which
enough.
is, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for that. You mentioned that juvenile convicts were punished more than their adult counterparts. I might have just missed something, but did they commit more offences than their adult counterparts on average over the course of their convictions, or were they just being more heavily punished in general?
They certainly had more offences on average, so obviously then that's why they had more punishments. I've also looked into why that might be. So, because most of the offences that these juvenile convicts committed while they were under sentence were minor offences, regulatory offences. And so the question then is, were they committing more offences or were they just being supervised more heavily? So if they were placed in, for example, the juvenile penal settlement Point Pure, they would have been more readily supervised, and so they may have been more readily picked up on those offences, whereas an adult convict committing the same offences or rule breaking when they were out on free assignment might be less likely to be picked up on it. And there's also the argument that if a convict had less skills, their free settler who they were assigned to will be more likely to turn them into the magistrate to be punished for offences because they were less useful to them. So if they had a very skilled convict, they would less likely to be reporting them. So while they had more offences, it wasn't necessarily that they were worse. But they did certainly have more offences, so they were had more punishment.
Have you identified any of the surgeons involved in the penal colonies in Tasmania where they were attacked? I've got a bad cold. Where they were attached, connected with. And you heard of John Anthony Moore. It's called John Anthony Moore, M-O-O-R-E.
No, I haven't really looked at the surgeons who were in the penal colony. Yes. No, I just mainly concentrated on the juvenile convicts. But, yeah, sorry.
I see.
I know you mentioned a number of places of origin. of the convicts, some in London, one in Cornwall. I noticed. Did you do looking at the urban or rural origins of the convicts?
So all the juvenile convicts in my sample were convicted at the Old Bailey. So some of them were born elsewhere and migrated into London, but they were all living in London when they were convicted. And I think they were, in my sample, they were around 2,000 male juvenile convicts who were convicted in the same period. But they didn't all end up in the colony. So some of them had their sentences mitigated. But I haven't looked at then convicts who were convicted elsewhere, apart from in secondary literature. You're certainly more likely to be sentenced to transportation if you were convicted at the Old Bailey as compared with other areas.
Can I sorry, I'll get to you in a second, James, but can I pick up on that idea? Because who gets arrested is dependent on factors that you're not necessarily going to be able to see from the records that survive. People like me and people like you don't get arrested when we do things wrong. We get away with those things because we know how the system works. The system works on our behalf. But there are lots of people that when they commit those crimes, they end up in front of judges and juries. And some of those people may have other factors that influence some of these variables that you're looking at, whether or not they're going to succeed. So I was out with a friend last night, and he works in the foster system, and he talks about how 30% of the kids that go through his system are going to end up in a courtroom for a criminal charge at some point in their lives. So they didn't have the support network that you and I perhaps had when we were kids. They've got other issues that have gone on in their lives that affect whether they're going to reoffend, whether they're going to be on a self-destructive path. And there's not really a great way for you to go back and do those did your mommy love you type things with these people. So is there any way you can kind of deal with that extra stuff that's it's related to rural versus urban?
Yeah.
Did somebody hug you when you were sad when you were 4 years old type stuff like that?
Yeah. Well, and of course you're absolutely right. You can't know all of the background information of these juvenile convicts. The most that can be done is looking at whether they had both parents, like simple things like that, and who was prosecuted. So some of them were prosecuted by their parents, and they were more likely to plead guilty, because if you imagine the scenario where your parents are saying you did it, they just admit it in court, and so they plead guilty and they don't really have a trial and they're transported. The only other way to look really at their background and family life is through the criminal petitions. And lots of the juvenile convicts did have criminal petitions where their families petitioned on their behalf to try and have their sentences mitigated. And then you learn something of their family life. So whether they had parents or whether they, so for example, one female convict, it's said that they were very poor and that they needed her to help support the family. So she was working as a nurse and they needed that. So you know about their economic stresses then. And other ones where they say that their father had died or their wife had left them and things like that. So you can have a peek at it, but of course it's not the whole story.
Have you factored that into the story you're telling? Or because a lot of what you've given us is statistics, but individual experiences make up those big patterns. So to what degree is that kind of coming out in the story that you tell, do you think?
Well, as much as possible, I try to go to these case studies where it unpicks what happened before they were transported and what happened afterwards, and to look at the varied pictures and the different life outcomes that happen, because they, of course, as in some of the case studies, you can see the different circumstances and also some of the similarities, so where they diverge from the pattern. So if you have a certain percentage of juvenile convicts who had something in common, it's also
No, they're my questions. No, they're mine. So it's a shortcut through two parts of your argument. Am I right in saying that you basically said that boys lacked skills and therefore were put in risky places of employment, therefore they might die more? Is that about right?
Vaguely.
Yeah. And that that there seems to be a similar kind of patterns going on, broadly speaking, with girls, but you didn't talk about skills. You didn't talk about whether or not they had skills and seemed to. And it's slightly crude, but it struck me that in a colony, young women do have a skill, is that they're able to help build the colony and that they have fertility, right? And I merely wonder whether that's something you'd thought about and talked about, or comes up in historiography in relationship to the different experiences of young people moving out to the colony, and whether they're being male or female, and being female has more of a bearing because they have an ability to kind of foster the colony in a way. My second question is totally different and goes back to health slightly and doctors, which is that I don't know much about the history of medicine, but I'm aware that in sort of the 18 teens into the 1830s, you start getting a notion of occupational health. Charles Thackeray in 1831, I think, publishes what's generally seen as the first book on occupational health, goes around the north of England, goes into lots of different workplaces and describes how terrible some of the conditions people are working in. It seems to have a bit of an impact, gradually, very slowly, of course, but a bit of an impact in a sense of the relationship between external factors and health. And even earlier, people are talking about things like the role of charcoal smoke and things like that in how people feel and how their kind of their experiences. And I wondered whether your work and your historiography you're working with is interacting at all with the historiography of health in this period and some of the changing notions of health, because it does seem as though, at least in the colonies, there's a very little, Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, whatever, there's very little sense in what you're saying of occupational health being a thing. And actually maybe some of the sort of the medical ideas that are developing in London on the mainland aren't making their way across to Australia in this period. So it's two very different questions, and so they're both quite long.
Okay. With the first question with regards to males and females arriving in the colony, I think completely different. I think with skills, you're right in saying that it's very difficult to find out what the female juvenile convicts did while they were there. And it's not because they didn't work. Even if they married, most of them would have supplemented the income by doing like laundry and lots of other things, but it just wouldn't be written down. And that's the problem of unpicking and finding out what they did. Whereas with the males, it was more likely to be noted down. And you can also then trace it through, not as well as in their convict records, where it says their skill when they arrive, you can also then trace their jobs through the birth certificates of their children, whereas it doesn't write down the females, which is obviously disappointing for historical research. And with the females, another thing was that when there were a lot more males in the colony than females, so they married very readily compared to the males who struggled to marry, or we don't know whether they wanted to marry or not, but most of them didn't. And with the females, most of them married, and it was also a way out of the convict system. So if they married, they could be assigned to their husband, and that obviously, but it meant that they were out of the female factories and they were assigned to their husband. And if it was a good husband, they had obviously then relative freedoms. And then, of course, they had children. So it's difficult. They definitely formed the colony in that way. But with their actual skills, it's very difficult to trace.
Do you know how many children they were having? Were they having more than an English woman was having typically?
Well, with my sample, because it's so small, it's difficult to tell. But in the historiography, generally they say that females in the colonies tend to have less children because they start having children later because of the servitude in like being under servitude. And then one of the arguments is that because of that, that meant that their children ended up being healthier and living longer because they had less mouths to feed. So definitely being transported there affected the next generation. Female juvenile convicts in my sample, they all went on to have children, but the numbers vary. And also if they were Catholic, it's hard to find how many they had. So you don't always find the total number of children because the Catholic records, they didn't have to keep them, the baptism records. So only if there's a parish record, you can find them. And
do you want to remind me of the question?
Yeah,
just the other question was basically, does the historiography of transportation interact with the historiography of medicine and the developments of occupational health in this period? I'm just intrigued. You may say I have no idea.
Yeah.
I'm just intrigued, really.
Yeah, I don't really know. They didn't always note down the causes of their death, or if it was disease, sometimes they just wrote disease. So I'm guessing that there wasn't a great interaction with it, but I haven't looked into it fully. Yeah.
I'd like to go back to the urban and rural differences in causes of crime. You're from Liverpool. You're from Liverpool.
Oh, yeah.
Liverpool's got a tradition of criminology based in the studies and criminological studies of John Baron Mays, who taught criminology at Liverpool in the Department of Social Science. Contention was that Liverpool being a city, he knew that about the crime of the city, in which the city origins of crime that he emphasised. I wondered, you're talking about the colonies, did they become agricultural settlements or a mixture of a town and farming or agriculture?
I think initially in Van Diemen's Land, it was very rural in parts. Obviously, they had the main towns, and that's something that people have argued that when convicts were first arriving, they were mainly being convicted in urban areas, and so they had urban skills, and then they were being transported to the rural Van Diemen's Land and being assigned to free settlers and not necessarily having those skills. And then later, as the colony developed, urban skills became more needed. So there was a slight skill barrier initially, but I think it wore off over time. But with the juvenile convicts, while I say they were less skilled than the adult convicts, a certain amount of skill, and some of them had begun apprenticeships. Not all of them had, but they had a small amount of skill. They just weren't as skilled as an adult convict, and also they weren't able to be placed into certain types of work which needed physical strength because they weren't all fully grown yet. So that's why they had less skill, but that isn't to say that they came with no skill.
They weren't necessarily skilled at being urbanites either, were they? Because they got caught and sent away.
There is that.
Sorry, I just have a follow-up about the petitions, because you also mentioned this Eliza White, was it? I don't know. So, and you mentioned that her parents also wrote this petition, but it was unsuccessful and so on. So, did you look at that specifically as a variable as to whether petitions of family members helped at all? Because you said in this case it was unsuccessful. Is there sort of a certain pattern emerging? Did it help if parents intervene, or it didn't? And if it didn't help, why is that the case? Or is there anything one can draw out from this?
I didn't specifically look at whether it helped them or not, because I only traced the ones that were transported. Mm-hmm. But as far as I can tell, there wasn't a great deal of difference, because quite a lot of these juvenile convicts had petitions, mainly, well, in fact, all apart from one written by their parents, and they didn't work. And it would be noted on the petition they wouldn't. So, for example, a male juvenile convict had his mother asked for mitigation and for him to be sent to the Parkhurst prison rather than be transported. And the official wrote on it that there was no real reason for it, so to transport him anyway. So I don't know how much it was taken into account, certainly of those who were transported in the Old Bailey. I don't know whether it would have made a difference in other areas.
Sorry, go ahead, Mia.
Sorry, I had a question about case studies, where you mentioned twice that some people's stories are poignant, and I wondered what effect you feel that might have on your research and on the historiography.
I try as much as possible, obviously, for it not to affect it. I think with juvenile convicts, because they were all convicted of very petty offences and then given to us, in our eyes, such harsh sentences of transportation, there is a tendency for it to be more poignant, but I try to look at the context of the time. So things like, while we see theft as obviously stealing a handkerchief as being nothing, at the time I try to look at what they saw at the time, and they saw it as a gateway into burglary, and they saw property crime was obviously more serious then. But certainly is something to be careful about, yeah.
Well, following on from that, I know it's quite a small sample size, particularly for female juvenile convicts, but probably for the male as well. Did the nature of the crimes they committed, I presume they're predominantly property crimes, but if they weren't property crimes, did that feature into the offences that they committed while under sentence in Tasmania, and potentially afterwards?
Yeah, so you're correct. All of the offences that led to transportation were property offences, primarily petty theft. There were a few burglaries and house break-ins as well, which are obviously more serious. And coining, but that was the same for males and females. Initially, I looked at the offences of those imprisoned and transported, and in the imprisonment sample, it was a lot more varied. So, and had offences which perhaps now we would see as more serious than the petty offences that resulted in transportation. So the manslaughter and sexual offences where they were just being confined for a certain period rather than being transported. As for the offences later on, they were all mainly regulatory and non-serious offences, but they were obviously, as with James McAllister, there was murder, but those are the rarities, and there was a couple who with piracy and bushranging, but again they were the rarities.
Your studies were Tasmania. I'm wondering, is it doesn't fall in your study? Do the conditions of in Tasmania compare with those of, say, Botany Bay? You've all heard of Botany Bay as an infamous place for deportment.
Yeah, well, it would have been completely different arriving in Van Diemen's Land in my period as opposed to when the first ship arrived in Botany Bay, because of course they had to set up the settlement, and the conditions would have been harsher. And so one of the arguments is that as time went on, transportation became easier because the towns became more settled. So Van Diemen's Land would have been more settled as compared to arriving in Botany Bay earlier on. But the authorities became aware of this belief within the community, the contemporary community, and so they made the punishments harsher. So instead of being able to become assigned and earn a ticket of leave, which would have given you, like probation today, given you more freedom to work on your own account, they were imprisoned for longer, certain periods of time in chain gangs and things like that. So it definitely changed over time. When you arrived in the colony would have affected your experience and the punishment, and where as well, certainly.
Oh, I'm talking about the period of Sir George Gipps, the Governor of New South Wales. Did he have overall authority of the other colonies in Australia? I think Fitzroy was a governor, Lieutenant Governor of Van Diemen's Land, wasn't he?
It changed over time. So initially, when they started sending convicts to Van Diemen's Land in 1803, it was governed from New South Wales.
Yes.
And then that changed then in the 1820s, I believe, to it being governed from Van Diemen's Land. So it changed over time, but yeah, they were initially controlled from New South Wales. Yeah.
The Governor of New South Wales was later was the Governor of Australia, wasn't it? But have overriding authority over the other colonies of Australia.
Yeah, initially over Van Diemen's Land, but then later on it would have been ruled by the Governor of Van Diemen's Land and then reporting to Britain. So it changed. Yes. Yeah.
You only talk about white people in this. So did the indigenous population come into this tale at all? Because presumably they were there, they were influencing and being influenced by what was happening.
With obviously my sample, I traced them from the Old Bailey, so it was just those who were convicted there, and obviously they were all white working class, mainly male. But certainly Indigenous Australians did end up in the convict system. There is a book out which is doing a similar thing, tracing the lives of convicts, but they're tracing the lives of Indigenous convicts. And they were certainly targeted and brought in within the convict system, but didn't interact within this story, you're right.
James?
Okay, so this is the ITR Digital History Seminar, and what we have different types of papers that give talks at our seminar, and yours definitely fits within one kind of group, which is the group which are talking about historical change and intervening historiographies of what they're interested in. And I'm curious then about the fact that this this project takes place within the context of a large project, Digital Panopticon. I was sort of joking earlier about the fact that you've got all the merchandise at the moment to do with it, and that's doing a number of things. That's doing some work on nominal record linkage. It's building databases. It's transcribing records. It's developing kind of different search and visualization techniques that work for the kind of data that we have here. So Old Bailey on one side, records when people arrive on the other, all the stuff that happens there. And I'm curious from kind of your perspective, having done your work in the context of that work, what aspects of what that project is doing are, I guess on one hand, really obvious to you that have great benefits to your research. And secondly, I guess the things that you kind of take for granted that if you look back upon it, you'd say, okay, I wouldn't be able to do this sort of if this project didn't exist. So sort of what is it about the context of the Panopticon project and its wider kind of, shall we say, digital aims that are enabling you to do what you do, and what bits you've relied on more than others?
Yeah, certainly. Obviously, the Old Bailey was already there, but other records which perhaps I wouldn't have had access to, I was able to access through the Digital Panopticon. They've done a lot of transcribing of the transportation records and sent databases from other people who have transcribed it. And so having access to that as a PhD student is obviously very useful. And also having access to all the people on the Panopticon website and having advice and going to the meetings and seeing what's going on. And also the general methodology that I used is the looking at life course analysis, which came from the Digital Panopticon, the idea of doing that. And I don't know if I would have thought to do it on juvenile convicts otherwise. So it's certainly influenced. Yeah, I think it's nice to be a part of a team and have all access to all those different records.
I guess interesting to me is you use the word access so many times, and that's really interesting. I guess the word you didn't use was labour, because there's a lot of labour going on under the surface of what you're doing here, where other people are doing things to make that access happen in a form which makes it easy for you to query it and work through it and create some of the kind of the database work that you're doing, which is probably why work of this nature hasn't been done until recently, which is that it takes a huge amount of work to go through these records. Actually, you haven't had to travel halfway across the world and go through huge amounts of records. Lots of what you've been doing, this isn't criticism.
Oh, no.
Lots of what you've been doing has been based on the labour of others who've done some work. And I find that really interesting, that's kind of seemed to then empower the access side, which then empowered the kind of the critical research side.
Yeah. So for instance, I've looked at juvenile convicts and traced their lives, which is building on Heather Shaw's work, who has looked at juvenile convicts. So when she did her PhD, she had to go to the archives, and they were not digitized, so she had to look at them physically, and mine were online, so that made it easier again. And like you said, having access to these records. And then I just think that the next stage, once the website is now up and running, if I did my project again, I wouldn't even have to collate all the different digital archives. It would just be put in a name and it would all be there. So it is that sense of it progressing, but it also means that only certain types of documents are looked at, because those are the ones that are digitized. So there is obviously the drawbacks of it as well.
Just to add to that, I think part of these databases being available that is so good is that the kind of statistical analysis that needs digitization, which I know I would just not be able to do without large-scale computer. It isn't possible without this sort of database, which is going to be really good for these kinds of projects as well.
Yeah, certainly once the digital panopticon, they're still adding things to it now, they'll be able to ask questions of the whole database, which will have lots of answers as to, for example, imprisonment versus transportation, and looking at those bigger questions, certainly, which wouldn't be possible looking at it archivally, physical archives.
James, under your question there, you talked about all the work that's supported Emma's project. Are you implying that it's not fair, almost, that you've got a team behind you, whereas other people are? Because what you can achieve with that team is obviously looks like quite a jump in terms of the historiography, whereas if somebody who's not part of that team had to do something similar, they wouldn't be able to achieve as much, would they?
I'm not suggesting that at all. What I'm thinking about is the fact that there is labour which enables you to do certain analyses, and then your labour then actually probably then contributes into the project, because the way Panopticon was sculpted is that, you know, quite late in the day does this become a kind of a product, a service, right? You still have to do a huge amount of work, which I could reconstruct some of what you've done using the Panopticon website, not as good as you've done, but some of it. And I guess what's interesting that the labour ends up being your work feeding into, via your supervisor, feeding into the design and production of a website in a way in which is probably hard to sort of disentangle from the broader kind of project, but you probably have had an impact. And so there's knock-ons, right? There's work going on which you don't have to do, which means you can do different kinds of work to think about tracing lives in the way you've done, which can then feed into how all the rest of us can trace lives. Now the product, I shouldn't use product, should I? But now the kind of the service is available for others to use. That's kind of where I was getting it. It wasn't a criticism as much as a kind of an interest in how being a project of this nature changes the space in which the PhD researcher kind of works in the context of archive and product at the end.
Yeah, I think having only done it this way is difficult to compare with doing it differently, but I would assume that it definitely does change how you approach your research. Yeah.
What kind of pressures did you feel as being part of that team from, for example, the PIs, the project leads on the project? What kind of pressures did they kind of fit you into in terms of sculpting the project? How much is this your project versus how much is it part of the project?
Well, as with the other PhDs on the project, we just go off and do our own project and do our own PhD, and then it's the RAs and the co-Is and the PI that did the database and all that. So completely free to do whatever we wanted, really. I think that the only criteria, because I answered an advertisement of a PhD, so it was advertised that it was the lives and criminal careers of convicts, and then I could choose within that what that meant. And I think it was very open to whatever I wanted to do within reason, as long as it met that criteria.
Obviously, you've never done it any other way, so you
Yeah.
know like to do it.
Do you regret picking juveniles? Are the records like particularly difficult to work with?
No, it's fine. Yeah, I don't regret it. I don't know what I would have done, what I do differently. They were relatively easy to find because they all have the ages on the record, so you can find juvenile convicts. I think I was disappointed that there were not so many female convicts, and I think that maybe one thing I would do differently is concentrate on female juvenile convicts by looking at a different time zone or like a longer period, or to try and uncover more female convicts, or look broader than London, maybe.
Do we have anything online?
It wasn't on Twitter.
No, I don't think we do, no.
Anyone have another question they want to throw out there?
Is Katie Roscoe involved in your project? Because I went to her seminar, you know, from Leslie Moreau.
Yeah, I know.
She gave me back some information about my common ancestor, you know, from a database it was, or some biographical details.
She's part of the Archipelago project.
Castle Archipelago.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Oh,
No, I
so-
have met her, but she's
Yes.
not part of this project. Yeah,
Oh.
I believe she's doing an RA now, an RA job or
What's this?
postdoc now.
She's coming here or something with a visiting fellow or
I think
something.
she's downstairs at the moment.
Oh.
Actually, in the maritime seminar.
There you go.
That's what, that's to do with slavery. That's what I would have gone to. I sort of missed this one on the list. Oh,
All right, well, let's thank Emma then for her talk and her conversation that she's given us as well. So thank you, Emma.
Before we close, I just want to advertise the next seminar, which is on the 12th of December. It's Lisa Smith from Essex who'll be talking about early modern recipes. Crown sauce, who knows, but early modern recipes more broadly.